Great. Hello, everyone. I first learned about Dorothy Wordsworth 2 years ago, and one thing that immediately resonated with me was learning that she never married, as I myself have no romantic inclination or desire to marry. And as I learned more about her life and read more of her writing, another thing that struck me was Dorothy's multiple lifelong friendships rather than a sole significant other. One focus of my undergraduate research and creative work was on aromanticism and asexuality. And for anyone who isn't familiar with these terms, I will put the definitions in the chat. But essentially, aromantic or aro refers to someone who doesn't experience romantic attraction, and asexual or ace refers to someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction. In my research, I felt a growing sense of kinship with Dorothy, as we had multiple shared experiences, and I resonated a lot with her writing. To further explore this connection, I wanted to read Dorothy's writing from an aromantic, asexual, or aro-ace perspective. In 2019, I wrote an initial reflective essay on this topic, which focused on Dorothy's prioritization of friendship and how I personally related, from my perspective as an aro-ace person. Reading more of her letters to friends, I picked up on themes similar to those expressed in contemporary aro-ace literature and by aro-ace communities. From these themes, I then developed an approach for reading her writing from an aro-ace perspective. A few key themes in my approach. 1, prioritization of friendship, not a second best to romance. 2, presence of multiple significant relationships in lieu of a significant other. And 3, presence of intimacy or closeness within friendship. This work then translated to the theme of Dorothy and friendship in the current exhibition at Wordsworth Grasmere. This exploration also included working with a group of aro-ace individuals over the course of 4 months.
So, as it was a very different kind of year, I think we began working in a much more innovative and I suppose our wildest dreams, we can do anything we want. We don't have to worry about the bounds of geography, which is one of the reasons why we were able to work with Samantha in the first place. And since we were online, we thought, okay, we want to form a group of people to discuss this topic with us, to share their thoughts. Where in the world should they be from? Obviously, we had to narrow it down just a little bit. So we settled on the Midwest USA, which is where Samantha's from, and the Northwest of England, where I am and where Wordsworth Grasmere is. So we reached out to a number of people in groups, and we were met with just an outpouring of kindness and enthusiasm. I think most of the people hadn't heard of Dorothy at all, but they were so keen to learn more. And they wanted to be part of a project that put aro-aces in the museum for people to learn about being aro-ace, the aro-ace experience, and for everyone to understand each other a little better. So we ended up with a group that was half based in the US and half based in the UK, and they became really fast friends. I think the online format allowed for a great deal of creativity and some really detailed, long conversations. We used Zoom for our monthly meetings, which were supposed to be an hour and a half, but they always ended up being 3 hours because we always had so much to say. And we also used Slack and email to talk on at length all kinds of topics. So we'd share inspirational videos, links to favourite exhibitions and articles. And we also spoke at length about Dorothy Wordsworth and the form that the project would take.
With this project, it was never the intention to prove anything about Dorothy in retrospect, but to just be curious about what might come out of this conversation. In our first session, the group got acquainted with one another and Dorothy. We prefaced our time together talking about our time versus Dorothy's time and our individual context versus hers, as well as the ideas of finding kinship and connection. We asked the question, is there something unique about our perspectives that brings something new to discussing Dorothy? And group members shared that reflecting on Dorothy from our aro-ace perspectives felt like seeing a familiar face, and that a lot of them saw their own experiences and feelings mirrored in Dorothy's writings. Someone saying, "Didn't I just write this?" The second and the third session, I presented my approach, allowing space for the group to reflect on how they might expand those themes. And then together we utilized this approach when reading passages from Dorothy's writing, primarily focusing on her letters to friends. Then we discussed and shared from our own experiences. I wanted to share an example of our analysis and discussion. Can I get the next slide, please? In Dorothy's Grassmere journal, there's a fairly well-referenced passage where she writes of her emotional overwhelm the night before and the morning of her brother William's marriage to Mary Hutchinson. This is sometimes treated as Dorothy being unreasonable or acting strangely, but from my vantage point, it made perfect sense. A change in her relationship dynamic, both with her brother and her close friend, Mary. Now, the quote on the slide, 5 days prior to this, Dorothy is writing to her childhood friend, Jane Pollard, and says, "Happy as I am, I half dread that concentration of all tender feelings, past, present, and future, which will come upon me on the wedding morning." Among the aromantic and aroace communities, there's a particular dread of losing close relationships to romance or marriage, and also the concern of being deprioritized. Many in our group related strongly to this idea, sharing stories from their own experiences. And I think this is well captured in one group member's written response. "Dorothy is speaking to one of my greatest fears of reaching adulthood with my friends. I've seen how dating separates groups of friends, and I fear how that distance will grow with marriage. A couple of my close friends are engaged, and while I'm happy for them, there's a sense of finality to the upcoming wedding, as if they are leaving our group of friends." All of our discussions and individual reflections informed our brainstorming process for display, which is to be included in the current exhibition. And Hannah will tell you about that.
Lex, can I have the next slide, please? So we'll give that a minute to load because it's so fantastic that it can't appear all at once. But once we'd settled on the form of our creative collaboration via discussion in our Zoom sessions and generally in Slack as well, we switched over to email for much longer in-depth explorations. The group decided that they wanted to respond to stories in Dorothy's letters with reflections on their own experiences. We arranged these as a large wall display which drew connections between sentiments expressed in Dorothy's letters 200 years ago, like those you've just seen, and the group's individual experiences today. The display also includes this incredible painting by group member SC, which I think is one of the loveliest depictions of Dorothy that I've had the pleasure of seeing, and I hope that we'll manage to show you today. If we don't manage to show you it today, open your email, you'll find a link to the PowerPoint and it's in there hiding. So Lex, if you want to try and let that load or move on to the next slide if it's not working, but we'll just keep going and we'll see how we go. So after we envisioned this fantastical wall display, of which I will eventually show you, we came up with this idea of a zine. So the group just had so much more to say and we couldn't figure out where to put it all. So if you haven't heard of a zine, it's a small self-published work comprised of text and images, which are usually reproduced via a photocopier. They're very handmade and very comforting and pleasing, and the personality of the contributors really comes across. So each group member created 3 or 4 pages of reflections to include, so everything they hadn't been able to fit into our display panel. So reflections about the project, their own experiences, and also Dorothy Wordsworth. And we thought this was a really fun and creative way of conveying the group's thoughts. We've put a few copies of the zine in the exhibition so you can read them when you're in there. If it really speaks to you, you can also request your own copy at the front desk. For those of you who can't make it, we've actually uploaded it online and I'll pop the link in the chat for you now, so you can go and have a look at it later. We'd really love it if you wanted to read and respond to the zine with your own ideas on friendship. We've included some ways for you to do that. And we've also included a little instructional diagram on how to fold and create your own 19th century letter. So I'll hand over to Samantha.
Okay, to conclude, I just wanted to return to the question we asked at the beginning. Is there something unique about our perspective that brings something new to discussing Dorothy? And in the end, I think we found not just something new, but something valuable. There are prevailing notions of Dorothy as a tragic spinster lacking romantic relationships and having a strange codependent sibling relationship with her brother. But I think this group, from their perspectives as aro-ace individuals, were able to recognize the significance of Dorothy's friendships and the substance of her life. Dorothy's relationship with William was mirrored in some of the group's own close sibling relationships, and they found the dynamic immediately relatable. Group members related to the care and intention Dorothy brought to her friendships and recognized Dorothy as not lacking anything at all. We hope that exploring these revelations in our display and in our zine will inspire you to reflect on Dorothy in a fresh light, as well as reflect on your own friendships and relationships. And that's all from us.
I wish there was a way of applauding these presentations. I'm sure in the homes and offices where people are watching, there is applause going on. As you said, Samantha, you started with an open question and you kept that open question, and it proved a very valuable line of inquiry. And I don't know, Hannah, whether you can just rejoin us for a second, just to mention that because I mentioned this in a presentation to a group of students at the University of Newcastle, and you sent the zine, didn't you, Hannah, to one of the students? And could you just tell us the response that you got?
Yeah, I did. One of the students reached out to me and asked for it. And they just sent back this wonderful outpouring and said how pleased they were to finally see themselves, not just in the pages of the zine, but in our museum. And I think that's one of the greatest privileges that we could ever have.
Yeah. It is a very well put together, very well supported line of inquiry, and I encourage people to download that zine. Thank you both very much, not just for the presentation, but thank you for what you've contributed.